Okay, so this is round two of supplementing this gap in the schedule where we had our canceled classes with the clearing of campus. So this one is to supplement the loss of Friday's class session on the 20th, where we were going to talk about tradition-bound rationality. So the video before this on distributed cognition opened up this area where our sensitivity to social patterns of interaction, the way that we're locked into patterns of interaction, shapes behavior, shapes thought in ways that sort of go beyond, some of the things we've been talking about before. But as we were talking about distributed cognition, we didn't necessarily we didn't talk about one aspect of the analogy, I guess you could say, with the gazelle or the fish, namely the herd. How do we clump into groups, into thought herds, such that we do our cognition together with others, we do our thinking together with others preferentially. We don't just do it with the wide world per se, especially not historically, but rather, we have a sort of fealty. We identify with particular others, and the way that we do our thinking is shaped by the social realities of who we identify with, more so. Okay. So this sort of topic needs sort of a counterpoint to fully sort of appreciate. And my cat apparently would like to say some things about tradition-bound rationality. So the counterpoint that's useful to have is the idea of reason that was had in the Enlightenment. This sort of dream of a universal reason, a universal grammar of thought, where anything that didn't fit this universal grammar of thought was unthought, was irrational, was not worthy of us as thinking individuals. So in the Renaissance, just prior to the Enlightenment, you had this sort of backward-looking movement that went back to the Greeks and the Romans for inspiration for something, a way of being human that could transcend cultural differences. And partly this was because of the wars of religion and the way that, we've kind of soured on our differences. But the Renaissance looked back to the Greeks and the Romans and saw a way of moving past where you were born, what language you spoke, what the stories that were told to you in your crib were, of using sort of logic and insights that transcended culture to be a sort of a reasonable global citizen. And the Renaissance eventually sort of gives way to the Enlightenment, which is more of a forward-looking sort of movement that's very much wedded to a self-understanding that takes progress in technology and science as being at the fore. In the original sort of early goings in the Royal Society, there was a lot of emphasis on our sin nature, actually, and the way in what's called the noetic effects of sin, the effects of sin on us as reasoners. So you'll see people justifying the scientific method, the experimental method, along these lines. We can't trust ourselves left to our own devices, and so we need to take special measures in order to know our world. But as we started to be rather successful, this sort of pessimistic basis for thinking about the rational project of science gives way to this much more optimistic view on which there's a real expectation that we are going to solve our problems through reason and through science, and that we've successfully found a way to, as it were, transcend culture, to have a culture of transcending culture. And it's understandable. It's kind of intoxicating to have these insights and realize, how people had been wrong for so long and how they thought the world worked, and that we could predict things and control things and produce a superfluity of things. That we really seemed in the Europe of the Enlightenment to be something new, something perhaps better. And this movement, this sort of self-understanding, is also linked to colonialism, right? So this sort of sense of self helps to explain colonial rationalizations, I guess you could say, and some of the colonial paternalism, the ways in which people would look down on those of other cultures as something different and less than, and how it would be almost sort of a benefit to the other culture to teach them our ways, because our ways aren't just different, they're not just ours. A certain amount of nationalistic pride, of course, is kind of universal, but a different sort of lens was on this. So the dream of a universal reason was very much, that part of our self-understanding was very much to the fore in how we related to cultural difference and how we understood ourselves. Okay, so obviously in the 20th century, there's a lot of protest against that perspective, a lot of reacting against that perspective, especially because that dream gives us the world wars in a way. You have people who think they're the apex of history, and the European nations each think they're the apex of history, and that the universal world social location transcending course of history is culminated in them in particular, and then of course they clash and create devastation like the world had never seen, and all their technological progress just allowed them to kill each other better. Okay, so part of the sort of swing back the other way in the 20th century is a sort of a fatal attraction toward relativism, toward sort of belittling and undercutting claims to knowledge and aspirations to truth and to getting at an essential human nature, by saying that we're so locked in our perspectives that we're not making contact with reality. So MacIntyre has his sort of, was the reading for this Friday, has a sort of relativistic sort of impulses, but especially in the reading I had given you, which is his a 1989 book, where he's sort of 8 years into this project. He's looking for a way of capturing the impulse to the pursuit of truth, while honoring the ways in which we're kind of tribal, that if we're going to sort of flourish, we have to reach for objective truth from within our location, from within our particular perspective and the way that we've been formed, from within the history of a particular people. Just trying to honor both of those things. This is where we're at with tradition-bound rationality. And it's useful in this context to remember contextualism, what we talked about before. That was the idea that knowledge isn't just some standard, that something that ignores the context of the knower, the person trying to know, but rather in high-stakes situations, the demands of knowledge look one way, and in low-stakes situations, the demands look another way. But of course, stakes aren't the only thing that can vary with the location of the knower, right? And indeed, there's a question of how do we know what the stakes are? The stakes themselves are kind of perspectival. What's high stakes to one person might not be high stakes to another person, given their perspective. So one of the things this draws into focus here is that the background assumptions that you bring to the table and your sort of expectations about how one comes to know what counts as evidence, right? What the methods are that make up inquiry. That the inquiry is organized by a set of expectations and background beliefs and desires and whatnot that don't come out of thin air, and that might interact with social context. Your beliefs about these things probably aren't just individual to you, although they might have an individual flavor, but rather you're sort of absorbing them from your context. So, for instance, an easy illustration of this is, from one theological context, from one sort of congregation, it might seem trivial to prove, that something related to, say, divine sovereignty or something like this, that that God, that the bad things that happen to us, God's say so on them or something like this. Whereas from another theological perspective, that might be something that we would really take some arguing or something like this, right? And of course, from an atheistic perspective, that would really take some arguing. Okay, so MacIntyre is drawing attention to the way in which your social location and its history sort of shapes what rationality looks like for a given person. That people live in sort of embodied traditions of inquiry, as it were, where people in that tradition tend to take the same sorts of things for granted, have some of the same sort of values, some of the same in inquiry, some of the same sort of exemplars in mind for what this looks like at its best, and a lot of the same sort of open questions and the things that we would like to solve. The sort of research program is to some extent shared. Okay. So with that sort of said, you don't just take, for MacIntyre, a set of views that's your culture and just believe them, but rather the history of inquiry in a tradition sets sort of internal standards on progress, on what counts as the narrative, the sort of narrative you tell yourself making sense. And that part of reasoning as a tradition-bound creature is knowing where the narrative, knowing what it would take for the narrative to sort of make contact with the world, make contact with your life as you experiencing it, and sort of being willing to press into that narrative to risk its being put in tension from within your own perspective. This is partly what makes it rational to think that you're moving toward truth, despite the fact that you're operating within a social location, within a tradition, is if a tradition from within its own lights is willing to put itself on the line, as it were, and have robust expectations for how the world will unfold, how a life will unfold, that can fail. And if they fail enough, then the tradition can be put in crisis, at which point MacIntyre has this sort of interesting idea that even though we're all bound within our perspectives, within our sort of socially mediated perspectives, our traditions, nonetheless, when one tradition can make sense the internal difficulties of the other tradition, sort of translate from within their perspective the self-understanding of the other person and why their tradition is in crisis, why there are internal tensions within the other person's story, then that creates sort of a bridge, a sort of intersection point between the two different perspectives, such that even though we are, perspective bound, we are social creatures, nonetheless, the presence of translators who can kind of make sense of the other person's, from within the other person's story, help them understand why that story might not be as good as someone else's story. Then you can have sort of rational conversion between perspectives, despite being tradition bound. And this leads to sort of an interesting perspective on what it is that philosophers are doing when they're debating, what it is that apologists might be doing, that isn't dependent on the idea that we can somehow transcend location, our social location, transcend our cultural background completely, since that might be an illusion. All right. And again, on Monday, we'll begin by taking questions, comments, and so on either distributed cognition or this stuff. Thanks.